I'm Lindsey German, I'm the convener of the Stop the War Coalition. I've also been involved in the People's Assembly since the very beginning, so we've planned for months now to be here, to be part of the demonstration, to hold a number of meetings and events and so on, and it's been an absolutely great few days. We found that we had placards which were about not bombing Syria and also about cut warfare, not welfare. And both of those were taken up throughout the big demonstration on Sunday, where there were 80 to 100,000 people. People obviously identify it. They care about a whole range of things, the health service or education or whatever the specific issue is. But they also care very much about the way in which increasingly neoliberalism has been connected with war, that we've seen more wars now than we've seen certainly in my lifetime, certainly more than at any time since the Second World War we now have. And this is very much connected to the economic system. They're not separate things, they're part and parcel. The same people who tell us we have to have austerity are also the people who tell us that we have to have wars. And unlike when it comes to looking after old people or looking after the sick or spending money on children's education, where they say there isn't any money, they suddenly find vast sums of money for weapons and for war, and I think people are increasingly making these connections. Well, of course, Syria you can't understand without understanding the war in Iraq, the invasion and occupation in Iraq. If you look at where ISIS comes from, it comes from the people who were opposing American occupation in Iraq, and that eventually they called themselves Islamic State, and then they made the decision a couple of years ago to also conduct operations in Syria. Now, in Syria, we've had a situation since 2011 where there was an uprising against Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. There's obviously very, very wide grievances among many people against him. There was this uprising, which was part of the Arab Spring, but unlike some of the others in places like Tunisia and at least initially in Egypt, it didn't result in his overthrow, and it became very, very quickly militarized into a civil war. In addition to that, you have many non-Syrian players involved directly in intervention, including Britain. Britain has troops in Syria. Britain uses 40% of British drone strikes that are going on supposedly over Iraq are actually being conducted over Syria. The Americans have been bombing, and their allies have been bombing Syria for a year now. And now the Russians are involved, and we say we're against all of this bombing, we're against the foreign intervention. We can see the real victims of this are the Syrian people, whatever their allegiance and whatever their views on this, and I guess that most of them take the view that they want to get away from this war, which is one reason we see so many people. I mean, we see them in Europe, the refugees, but so many more refugees in Turkey and in Jordan and all the countries around, because their lives have been destroyed by the war. So we're very concerned that this is becoming more and more the cockpit of a war involving, it is involving already Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Jordan, Iran, the United States, the United Kingdom, France is bombing, Britain is now going to vote for this, and this is a complete disaster. It'll mean more refugees, it'll mean more terrorism, because all the evidence is that the airstrikes that take place, and the Americans did a study on this a few years ago about Iraq, that when you hit individuals, as they've done, and kill individuals who are in Islamic State or whatever they're in, actually, as one American soldier put it, there's somebody to replace him who is younger, smarter, and more committed to the cause, and so that's going to happen as well. And of course, many civilians, innocent people, are killed, injured, displaced. So it's a complete disaster, and only somebody as cynical as David Cameron would use the refugee crisis to try to justify bombing even more people. Well, always when people say we have to do something, my answer is we already are doing something, and that's what's caused a lot of the problems in the region, and that our doing something, the war in Afghanistan, which is still continuing as we've seen over the last week in Kunduz, the war in Iraq, the bombing of Libya, and now the attacks on Syria have created this situation. And of course ISIS are not a massive force. I mean, people estimate them 30,000, 40,000. They have a few thousand foreign fighters from Europe and the United States. The biggest number of their foreign fighters are from regional countries, or other Arabs, in other words. But they're not a gigantic force. If we stop the funding, if we stop allowing them to sell oil across the Turkish border, if we stop all the help that they're getting from these various powers, and I believe this help will increase as now the Russians are in there, because there will be a move by Saudi and Turkey to limit the effects of the Russians. If we stop doing that, that would deal with a lot of the problem of ISIS. Then there has to be a political solution, not a military solution to the problems of the area. The military solution is going to draw the whole of the Middle East into a much bigger war, and we won't have seen anything yet to what we will see if that happens. It will be a full-scale war between countries which are heavily armed. Saudi Arabia gets a huge amount of arms from this country. It's doubled its military expenditure in the last decade or so. I mean, it's a major military power now. Israel's there as a major military power. You go through, Iran, all of these are sizable powers, and this will be the most gigantic war if it happens. 2 years ago, Cameron wanted to bomb Syria, but he wanted to bomb Assad. That vote was defeated. Labour voted against it, and that meant he couldn't do it. He could only bomb Iraq, which has been going on for the last year. Now he's coming back and saying we don't want to bomb Assad this time, we want to bomb ISIS. Although, had there been a vote to bomb Assad 2 years ago, we might now see ISIS in Damascus. So the whole thing is very disturbing, and completely, it seems to be the only consistency is they just want to bomb, and they don't really care how they do it and who they do it to. I think they will try to get the vote. I think it's extremely important that now we have Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, who I'm confident will be against any such intervention, that actually he calls for a whipped vote of Labour MPs, that it's not a free vote. A free vote, it seems to me, will make it much easier for Cameron to get to win his position, because it's clear to me that some Labour MPs are more interested in defeating Jeremy Corbyn over this question than they are of caring about the Syrian people. So I feel very, very strongly that we should oppose a free vote by Labour, that we should do everything we can to lobby MPs, and that we need to do everything we can before this vote, which will probably be later in October, to make it clear to MPs that our message is don't bomb Syria. Well, I think there's immense value of protests, as we've seen this week. I think actually the protest we had on Sunday, whether or not it immediately stops Tory policies, highlights the great strength of feeling there is against these policies, and also means that the Tory conference isn't able to just project its message that it wants to get across, but it's forced to have to confront the questions that the protesters are bringing up over a whole range of issues. I don't agree about 2003. I think actually what we did in 2003, we didn't stop the war, but I think we did create a very strong anti-war opinion in this country. I also think that you can see the Stop the War movement as one of the things that fed into Jeremy Corbyn's election victory, and is one of the reasons that Tony Blair and Blairism are now totally discredited. They have never got over the Iraq war, and they've never got over the fact that they ignored the protests of 2 million people, 30 million people estimated around the world, who were against it. It's the biggest ever protest in the world. Now, to my mind, that tells you that changing opinion often takes longer than you want, and when you're up against an international military machine that is determined to go to war, it's very, very hard to stop it. Nearly all anti-war movements actually take place after the war has started, so it's a very, very hard thing to stop it, but we came as close as we possibly could to stopping it, and I think we're now seeing the political consequences of that whole process. So I do believe getting on the streets, protesting, is not the only thing that you do in terms of campaigning, but I think it's an absolutely central part of what we have to do. Yeah, I mean, I think it's astonishing, really, that as you say, that he's accused of being a softie, as if pushing a button is a difficult thing to do. And of course, no British Prime Minister ever, going right back. I mean, Churchill was Prime Minister when they had the nuclear bomb. No Prime Minister ever in Britain has ever come close to even thinking about pressing it. I mean, that is the honest truth. The only time when there's been crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 1960s, it's only ever been between the Americans and the Russians, and they were always the two main things. And Britain always wanted its own bomb, but was always very, very much subservient to the United States. This is still true. It is absolutely inconceivable that Trident or any other nuclear weapon could be used without the agreement of the United States. And it's also inconceivable that Trident would exist without the agreement of the United States, because it produces the missiles for it. I feel this is an argument which, although you've seen all these right-wing press and everybody saying how terrible Jeremy Corbyn is, he doesn't want to destroy the lives of millions and millions of people, which to lots of people I think anyway think, well, fair enough, I agree with him about that. Who would want to? Who would say that they wanted to start a nuclear war? Because of course, I don't know whether people understand this fully, but any nuclear war launched by Britain is met with instant retaliation. So if you fire nuclear missiles at your enemy, presumably Russia, because not that many powers have nuclear weapons, then London will be annihilated. That's what will happen. That's what nuclear war means. That's why it hasn't, thankfully, happened up to now. Now, this was an argument which, of course, we had to win. I mean, I was a child in the 1950s, and that's when the CND protest first started. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. My aunt, who lived in East Anglia, phoned my mother and said, "You must get the girls and hitch a lift on a lorry because London's going to be destroyed." That's how frightened people were. And of course, they'd all lived through a war only 20 years earlier. And my aunt and my mum lived in London, and they'd been bombed, and people knew what, and that was conventional bombing. It wasn't nuclear war. So people were absolutely terrified. We have to actually make that argument again and make it absolutely clear to people that that what's going on in the Middle East is terrible enough, where people are bombed from 30,000 feet. But nuclear war is in a completely different register. And actually, if nuclear war succeeds, not only will most of us be dead, but there will be a nuclear winter for 1,000 years. And we cannot have that happening. So this is a real existential question, if you like, and Jeremy Corbyn is absolutely right about this. He's absolutely right to say that he wouldn't want to use nuclear weapons. It is completely ludicrous that we have Trident nuclear weapons, which don't deal with any of the threats, the current threats, particularly terrorism. They've absolutely no use in any sense about this. There can be accidents which can have the same effect as somebody firing one, and we've had accidents to do with nuclear weapons and nuclear power stations before. So I think Jeremy is absolutely right to say this, and I think we need to be absolutely clear that we do oppose them. And then, if you want any other argument, they are going to spend a total of £100 billion on renewing these weapons, which firstly are incredibly dangerous and secondly are in any case obsolete. So it seems to me at a time when they're telling us they can't afford all these other things, it's really a no-brainer. And it is terrifying how many people just say we've got to defend ourselves. I mean, we have virtually no aircraft carriers in this country. There's a very, very small navy compared to what it was like even 30 and 40 years ago. People have moved on. People do move on in terms of weapons. We've got rid of chemical weapons. All of those things which Britain used to have, and nobody said, we can't defend ourselves. And why do we want to defend ourselves against most people? Why not have a foreign policy which means that you're cooperating rather than feeling that you're creating enemies around the world? But I think it's about a wider question, which is about strategic control of countries and therefore of markets, and the need to extend the market on a global scale. And that means you have to have governments who are amenable to this effort. This is what they tried to do, for example, in the European Union, which is why they were so harsh about Greece and the deficit, because they want governments which will do what the international community, so-called, says. So what you've got, it was famously put, 20 years or so ago, when neoliberalism was developing, that you can't have McDonald's without McDonnell Douglas. In other words, if you want to get American investment, Western investment, all these things into different parts of the world, you have to have military power to make sure that there aren't any so-called rogue states, to make sure that you have freedom to make profit in these countries. And of course the whole war machine is a profit-making institution in itself. The only answer to it is that you need a world which isn't based on profit and which isn't based on imperialism, it isn't based on war, and that actually we create a world which is for the benefit of the whole of humanity. And we're fortunate in this part of the world that most of us haven't had to be refugees. There are 200 million people on the move in the world today as refugees, as people, as economic migrants, as they're called. Now that's not just about war, but it's also about what the economic system is doing to traditional societies, is doing to the environment, is doing to all these different sorts of things. So yeah, I think we have to have a system change really to be able to deal with this.